Episode 35, The History of Moonshine. Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is Poisoned Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed last week's episode on the West Virginia Penitentiary. I thought it was pretty interesting. Today I'm going to talk about something as American as apple pie, or, well, apple pie flavor at least. If you know, you know. Moonshine. It's most definitely an Appalachian thing. I want to cover the history of moonshine. Is it dark Appalachia? I think so. I mean, it was never legal. It has ties to the mob, and there's a lot of under-the-table stuff going on. I think that's considered pretty dark. And as I said, it's my podcast, and I make the rules, so we're going to talk about the history of moonshine today. I feel like we probably all know what moonshine is, and probably most of us have had it before. But in case I have foreign listeners, or people who may not know much about it, let's go over the history of moonshine. Moonshine, a legally distilled liquor, has a rich history in America. Rooted in the resistance to federal taxes on spirits and the practice of distilling at night to avoid detection, giving rise to the name moonshine. In every part of America, early moonshiners worked their stills at night to avoid detection from authorities. The United States started taxing liquors and spirits shortly after the American Revolution. In the years following the Revolution, the United States was struggling to pay the bills for the long war. Taxing liquor and spirits was an effective way to generate revenue for the government. In the early frontier of American history, moonshine wasn't a hobby, it was a part-time job. Many farmers relied on moonshine manufacturing to survive bad years. Low-value corn crops would be turned into high-value whiskey. Americans hated paying liquor taxes. They hated taxes so much that revenuers, the government agents who came to collect the taxes, were often attacked, tarred, and feathered, and when they came to visit. The tension between the government and its citizens eventually boiled over into a conflict called the Whiskey Rebellion, which began in 1791 during George Washington's presidency. In 1791, Congress approved a new federal tax on spirits and the stills that produced them. For farmers on the frontier of the new nation, the production of whiskey was an important method of converting large amounts of grain into liquor, which was easier to transport across the Appalachian Mountains for sale in eastern markets. In 1794, farmers from western Pennsylvania rose up to protest what they called as an unfair taxation and provided the new nation and George Washington with a looming crisis. The creation of this excise tax, which helped spark the conflict that became the Whiskey Rebellion, was led by Alexander Hamilton, George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. In an effort to pay off debts from the American Revolution is why he did this. If any of y'all have listened to Hamilton, you may have heard a little bit about this in the Capitol battle. Thomas Jefferson says, "Look, when Britain taxed our tea, we got frisky. Imagine what gonna happen when you tried to tax our whiskey." So that was kind of partially what that was about. In 1790, in order to solve a congressional deadlock over the permanent placement of the new nation's capital, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison reached a compromise that would result in an eventual shift of the capital to a location on the border of Maryland and Virginia, as well as a promise that the federal government would assume the Revolutionary War debts of the 13 states. The 1791 passage of the whiskey excise tax was an attempt to begin paying down the debt through a direct tax on the distillation of alcohol. Unfortunately, this tax on production adversely impacted farmers on the western frontier. These small-scale farmers did not have the ready cash to be able to pay the taxes and were unable to easily pass on the burden to their customers, like the operators of large distilleries in the East could. Taken together with feelings that the government in the East was not doing enough to resolve problems with Native Americans, who would soundly defeat an American army at the Battle of Wabash in the fall of 1791, in addition to the issue of free navigation on the Mississippi River, which had been closed by Spain in 1784, the excise tax fueled an already growing fire of animosity between the frontier counties throughout the states. Reaction to the passage of the tax was swift and ranged from simple refusal to pay to outright violence against the tax collectors tasked with inspecting stills and collecting payments. Tax collectors who were brave enough to establish offices in the western counties faced threats and even public humiliations such as being tarred and feathered. Even farmers who paid the tax were not safe, as their stills were often damaged and destroyed by neighbors who were incensed at their compliance. In western Pennsylvania, opposition to the excise tax was particularly violent. Threats against tax collectors became terrifying reality when an armed and angry mob marched on the home of John Neville, the local tax collector. Neville had been assisting Federal Marshal David Lennox in serving writs to still owners in the region who had not paid the excise tax. These writs demanded that the individuals who were served papers appeared before a federal court in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. During an attempt to serve one of these writs at the home of William Miller on July 15, 1794, shots were fired and the two men forcing Neville to return to his home at Bower Hill while Marshal Lennox fled to Pittsburgh. The next day, a group of several dozen armed militiamen surrounded Neville's home and demanded that Lennox be surrendered to them. Shots fired from inside the home forced the rebels to retreat, leaving at least one militiaman mortally wounded. The next day, Major James McFarland led hundreds of militiamen back to Bower Hill, intent on forcing Neville to resign from his position. With his home reinforced by United States Army soldiers from the garrison at Fort Fayette in Pittsburgh, and under the command of his brother-in-law, Major Kirkpatrick, Neville was able to escape before firing between the two sides broke out. Major McFarland was killed in exchange of gunfire, and Neville's home and outbuildings were subsequently burned by the rebels. McFarland's death further inflamed the countryside, and several weeks later resulted in close to 5,000 rebels gathering several miles outside of Pittsburgh for the purpose of capturing the city. Although the March on Pittsburgh was ultimately defused, the sequence of violent events spurred the government in Philadelphia to action. President Washington's response to these actions was swift and decisive. A proclamation issued on August 7, 1794, Washington identified the frontier violence as treasonous acts that amounted to levying war against the United States. A group of state and federal commissioners was sent to western Pennsylvania to negotiate with a group of delegates from Allegheny, Washington, Westmoreland, and Fayette counties. Although a meeting of this group resulted in a resolution that affirmed submission to the government, popular referendum was not as clear. In the end, the commissioners recommended that the military would be necessary to put down the rebellion and restore the Militia Act of 1792. After a judge notified the president that the laws could not be safely executed, the president could call forth a militia. Washington called up the state militias from Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New Jersey, which ultimately amounted to close to 13,000 troops to put down the rebellion by force if necessary. Divided into two wings that staged in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and Cumberland, Maryland, Washington personally led a portion of the army as far west as Bedford, Pennsylvania. When the army reached western Pennsylvania, they did not find the population in open rebellion. The mere presence of such a large force of federalized militia was enough to send rebel leaders into hiding. In the end, while a number of rebels were arrested and tried for treason, only a handful were found guilty, and all of these individuals would eventually be pardoned by either President Washington or later President Adams. In the end, rebellion was put down and order restored, as Washington noted in a letter to the Army's commander, General Henry Lighthorse Lee. Written shortly before his departure from Bedford, his troops had preserved the blessings of that revolution which, at much expense of blood and treasure, constituted us a free and independent nation. And then during the Civil War, the American government once again imposed excise taxes on the citizens to fund the war. Revenuers and IRS officials cracked down harshly on moonshiners, leading to many violent conflicts throughout the country. During the Whiskey Rebellion, moonshiners were portrayed as heroes standing against the oppressive government. After the Civil War, that attitude shifted. Many now saw moonshiners as violent criminals. From 1920 to 1933, America was in the Prohibition era. In 1920, moonshiners across the country rejoiced. Prohibition was passed across the nation. Legal alcohol was no longer available anywhere. Overnight, illegal liquor became one of the most profitable businesses in America. But how exactly did Prohibition come about and why? I'll be honest with y'all here, I don't drink. I'm not opposed to other people drinking, I just don't. But even coming from me, a teetotaler, I don't understand Prohibition. When looking at it on the outside, it looks like a bunch of people got together to say that drinking was bad. Led by the pietistic Protestants, Prohibitionists first attempted to end the trade in alcohol drinks during the 19th century. They aimed to heal what they saw as an ill society beset by alcohol-related problems, such as alcoholism, domestic violence, and saloon-based political corruption. Many communities introduced alcohol bans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and enforcement of these new prohibition laws became a topic of debate. Prohibition supporters called dries presented it as a battle for public morals and health. However, there is a darker side to the reason for prohibition also. If you listen to my article on the Ku Klux Klan, you may recall that there was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time, and there's a lot of hatred of European immigrants. America's temperance movement was fueled in large part by anti-immigrant sentiment. Particularly in the religious southern region of the U.S. known as the Bible Belt, people believed that banning alcohol would keep out Irish and Italian immigrants who were stereotyped as drunkards, and German immigrants who made up the bulk of brewery owners. The Ku Klux Klan was a major supporter in the anti-alcohol movement. Klan members found unlikely bedfellows with socialists and unionists who, under the organized banner of the Industrial Workers of the World, supported the temperance movement because of the belief that alcohol was a capitalist tool used to keep the working man down. At the core of the movement to ban alcohol, though, was the Protestant Church. The Anti-Saloon League, the main pro-prohibition lobby, garnered most of its support from Protestant members, and this loose coalition of temperance advocates gained the momentum it needed to ban alcohol nationwide for 13 years. Banning alcohol did barely anything to curb drinking in America, though. In fact, the parts of society that kept the drinking going did so in an even bigger and more boisterous way. There were far more illegal speakeasies during Prohibition. Manhattan alone had 5,000 than there had been legal saloons previously. Speakeasies complete with hidden doors, passwords, and secret escape routes could be found in every American city. Despite the Christian temperance movement, the South was not immune to the illicit alcohol market either. The rural and mountainous Appalachia region was rife with hidden pockets producing moonshine, which is what we're talking about, illegal liquor made at night by the light of the moon to avoid authorities. Home distilled hard liquor was called bathtub gin in northern cities and moonshine in rural areas of Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Making drinkable hard liquor was easier than homebrewing good beer. Since selling privately distilled alcohol was illegal and bypassed government taxation, law enforcement officers relentlessly pursued manufacturers. In response, bootleggers modified their cars and trucks by enhancing the engines and suspensions to make the faster vehicles that would improve their chances of outrunning and escaping agents of the Bureau of Prohibition, commonly called revenue agents or revenuers. These cars became known as moonshine runners or shine runners. Side note here on moonshine runners, NASCAR actually got a start with moonshine runners. I get this from the Mob Museum website. It said from North Carolina to Spokane, Washington, bootleggers during Prohibition used souped-up automobiles to stay ahead of federal agents and local police while transporting illegal whiskey on back roads in the dark of the night. The idea was fairly simple. Take a car that looked ordinary on the outside, modify the engine for greater speed, remove the floorboards, passenger and back seats to store as many cases of liquor as possible, install extra suspension springs to handle the weight, and a dirt-protecting plate in front of the radiator, and run the prohibited booze to customers by outsmarting and outrunning the authorities. To elude federal prohibition agents and sheriffs and cops on the roads, these daring runners needed sharp driving skills and speed to maneuver along dirt, gravel, single lane, and occasionally paved roads after dark and at times with their headlights turned off. Even before the Prohibition came to an end in 1933, racing these high-performance cars became a popular pastime among the runners in North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, and elsewhere in the South. They raced each other's cars, many of them Ford models, on weekend afternoons out in the country on makeshift dirt tracks. Such were the bootlegger roots of the stock car and what would evolve into the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, or NASCAR, in 1947. Booze runners looked for good mechanics who knew how to make their engines run faster and handle better than police vehicles. This became even more important in 1932 when Ford introduced his flathead V8 with 8 cylinders, a powerful car that runners started using as did police departments to keep pace. By the nature of their illegal business, veering fast along curvy mountainous roads, runners taught themselves to be the best stock car drivers of the era and beyond. Although national prohibition ended in 1933, production of illegal whiskey continued for years afterwards to avoid taxes and regulations. Many future NASCAR drivers cut their teeth bootlegging illegal moonshine in the 1940s, such as NASCAR Hall of Famer Junior Johnson, who won his learner's permit by running corn mash hooch before his NASCAR debut in 1955. So there's just a little bit of info about that, but now back to the moonshine itself. Prohibition practically created organized crime in America. It provided members of small-time street gangs with the greatest opportunity ever, feeding the need of Americans coast to coast to drink beer, wine, and hard liquor on the sly. Organized racketeers dominated the illegal bootlegging industry, as well as the urban machine bosses and the vice kings. They understood banking and other legitimate businesses and bribed policemen, judges, juries, witnesses, politicians, and even federal prohibition agents as the cost of doing business. Organized crime took over the moonshine business, and distillers sprung up across the country to keep up with the demand. Producers began to sell watered-down moonshine based on sugar instead of corn. Seems like an unlikely pairing, mobsters from Chicago and moonshiners from Appalachia, but turns out it was a match made in heaven, or, well, somewhere. By the early 1920s, profits from the illegal production and trafficking of liquor were so enormous that gangsters learned to be more organized than ever, employing lawyers, accountants, brewmasters, boat captains, truckers, and warehousemen, plus armed thugs known as torpedoes to intimidate, injure, bomb, and kill the competitors. They bought breweries closed because of Prohibition and hired experienced brewers. They ran boats into the ocean and lakes to buy liquor from Great Britain and Canada, leading to the term rum running. They paid individual citizens to operate stills at home and make gallons of bad-tasting booze. They sold illegal beer, watered-down whiskey, and sometimes poisonous rotgut booze in thousands of mob-owned illegal bars known as speakeasies. Often, to screen customers at these illegal bars, a bouncer would look through a peephole in the front door before refusing them or letting them in. The new alcohol trafficking gangs during Prohibition also crossed ethnic lines, with Italians, Irish, Jews, and Poles working with each other. Although intergang rivalries, shootings, bombings, and killings would shape the 20s and early 30s, more than 1,000 people were killed in New York alone in mob clashes during the Prohibition. The period sparked a revolution in organized crime, generating frameworks and stacks of cash for major crime families that, though far less powerful, still exist today. The good times couldn't last forever for moonshiners. In 1933, Prohibition was repealed, and the moonshine market dwindled to a shadow of its former self. The 18th Amendment was repealed on December 5, 1933, with the ratification of the 21st Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Despite the efforts of Herbert J. Grant, president of the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints, the 21 Utah members of the Constitutional Convention voted unanimously on that day to ratify the 21st Amendment, making Utah the 36th state to do so, and putting the repeal of the 18th Amendment over the top in needed voting. Franklin County, Virginia was believed to produce the highest volume of legal liquor in the U.S., colloquially referred to as the moonshine capital of the world. Local lore and historical footnotes weave the tale that during 1 year of Prohibition, more sugar was shipped by rail to Boone's Mills in Franklin County than in New York City. The sugar coming in high amounts is what made people suspicious. Historians estimate that in the 1920s, 99 of every 100 Franklin County residents were in some way involved in the illegal liquor trade. The bootleggers became involved with gangsters from Chicago and other major cities, and some local law enforcement officials were part of the criminal activities and killing of competitors. Between 1930 and 1935, local still operators and their business partners sold a volume of whiskey that would have generated $5.5 million in excise taxes at the old 1920 tax rate. It is said that more sugar was delivered to Boone's Mill, Virginia during Prohibition than in New York City. Sugar is a key ingredient for making hooch, firewater, white lightning, moonshine. Red flags brought revenuers to Southeast Virginia, and eventually sugar was bought by legitimate businesses like bakeries as a cover for the real operations. But moonshine was still being produced and bootlegged, maybe not in such large quantities, but enough that it was a problem. Which leads us to the moonshine conspiracy trial of 1935. By the 1930s, folks were so intertwined with moonshine that the national spotlight came to rest on Franklin County. The federal government suggested it had been defrauded $5.5 million in excise whiskey taxes, which I mentioned earlier. That equals to $95 million in today's money, and thus brought forth the Great Moonshine Conspiracy Trial of 1935. It was lengthy in both duration and defendants. At 10 weeks, it was the second longest trial in Virginia history, behind that of Aaron Burr in 1807. Of 23 defendants, 20 were convicted. Those indicted included a former Franklin County sheriff and multiple deputies, a former member of the Virginia House of Delegates, a Virginia Prohibition officer, and Franklin County's Commonwealth's attorney. While the government didn't like people drinking during Prohibition, they really didn't like losing taxes on it when it was reinstated. The U.S. government sent agents to check in on everything. The conspiracy was uncovered by federal agent Colonel Thomas Bailey, who was a World War I hero. He posed as a small-scale moonshine buyer. He went undercover in Franklin County in 1934. Unlike previous attempts to curtail illegal liquor production, Bailey's plan sought to protect rather than arrest the small distillers in exchange for incriminating information that could lead to the arrest of the conspiracy's ringleaders. Although Prohibition was no longer in effect, illegal moonshine was still a thriving industry, as moonshiners went to great lengths to avoid paying taxes for their products. Some government officials in Franklin County accepted bribes to look the other way and protect bootleggers from other lawmen and moonshine distillers. Even the sheriff of Franklin was in on the racket, overseeing a complex bribery system for the biggest moonshine production in the region. So by using the tax rate instituted in 1920, moonshiners in Franklin County would have generated $5.5 million in taxes between 1930 and 1935 if they had legally sold their products. During this same time period, more than 1 million 5-gallon cans used for storing whiskey were purchased in the county, and 37 tons of yeast were ordered, 9 times that of the capital city of Richmond. These details and a lack of tax revenue caught the attention of lawmen on a national level, and a federal investigation began. The trial would pitch Franklin County into complete chaos, with threats, jury tampering, and the murder of a key witness, along with an uninvolved bystander happening during the proceedings. 2 men connected to the illegal liquor trade in West Virginia would be charged and convicted of the murders, but another witness perished under suspicious medical causes during the trial, casting doubt on whether the trial could possibly end with a successful outcome. The 10th trial was the second longest in Virginia's history, and in the dramatics of the case, consistently kept it on the front page of newspapers, not only in Virginia, but papers all around the country. Local moonshining legends kept the attention of readers who loved tales of individuals like Mrs. Willie Carter Sharp, who was known as the Queen of Roanoke Rum Runners. A little bit about Willie Carter Sharp. Sharp had been arrested 13 times between 1921 and 1932 for driving offenses. She began piloting bootleg runs in 1926, leading convoys of bootleggers transporting illicit spirits through Franklin County, Virginia, as well as serving as a blocker, hindering police attempts to intercept the convoys. Sharp reportedly became one of the best-known rum runners in Virginia, having involvement in the movement of somewhere between 79,000 and 200,000 gallons of illicit liquor. In 1932, Sharp commenced a three-year sentence in the Alderson Reformatory for Women for violations of the National Prohibition Act. Sharp testified as a federal grand jury investigating illicit liquor smuggling in Franklin County in November 1934, and in 1935 testified as a witness in the trials of 34 people accused of illicit liquor offenses. Prior to the commencement of the trial, Sharp was arrested in St. Louis as a material witness, which brings us back to the trial. After roughly a year, Colonel Thomas Bailey was allegedly able to uncover a complex system driven by bribery and extortion in which distillers would supposedly pay local sheriffs for protection from law enforcement agencies. The conspiracy was discovered when undercover federal agent Colonel Thomas Bailey posed as a small-scale buyer in 1934. He successfully turned small-time distillers into informants. After a year, he unraveled Sheriff Hodges' payment system. Roughly 6 years prior, Sheriff Hodges divided the county into 2 districts headed by deputies. Each deputy was ordered to find moonshiners and collect protection money, $25 per still, $10 per load of whiskey, and $5 per filling station. The thing is, at the time, the governor of Virginia had directed law enforcement officers to take fines from whiskey makers whenever possible in order to relieve congestion in both the courts and jails in the Commonwealth. Bailey's case took roughly 2 years to build and charged the defendants with 68 separate counts of illegal activity related to the production of untaxed moonshine whiskey. The prosecution summoned 176 witnesses, most of which, if not all, were convicted criminals, versus the defense's 69. It took roughly 10 weeks for the entirety of the testimony to be heard. In fact, many of the government's witnesses likely had ulterior motives in testifying for the prosecution because they had been previously convicted by the efforts of some of the defendants. So, it wasn't a clean-cut trial, no matter what. Testimonies during the trial recounted how deep bootlegging was in the day-to-day. Testimony from 176 witnesses during the 1935 trial unveiled the extent of bootlegging in Franklin County. Several witnesses reported to have moved hundreds of thousands of gallons over a period of 5 or 6 years. According to the Blue Ridge Institute Museum, agents in Floyd County alone destroyed 3,909 stills, made 1,669 arrests, and seized over 716 vehicles with 130,717 gallons of alcohol during Prohibition. After a 10-week trial, the jury reached a verdict within 2 days on July 1st, 1935. After a grueling 2-month trial, the verdict was finally made public on July 1st, 1935, which I just said. After an examination of the evidence, County Commonwealth Attorney and grandnephew of Robert E. Lee, Charles Carter Lee, along with 2 others, were acquitted, with the other 30 defendants found guilty. Of the charges that were levied against the guilty parties, most were so light that many of them were back in business before they had even been sent to serve their jail time. The Great Moonshine Conspiracy Trial of 1935 resulted in little real effect on the legal liquor production in Franklin County, Virginia. Yeast, malt, and sugar were added to the moonshiner's taste. The grain was ground into a mash which was soaked into hot water with yeast to ferment the mixture. Copper was used for the pot, called a still, as well as for all the piping. The still was then heated to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, 78 degrees Celsius, at which point the alcohol evaporated and distilled through a pipe at the top of the still. As the mixture cooked, the sugar sometimes gave off a sweet odor, which was often tracked by revenue agents and used to locate illicit stills. Unlike traditional whiskey, which by definition is aged, moonshine was not aged. Less water was added to the distillate than is traditionally done with legal whiskey, and this ensured that the alcohol content was higher when it was packaged and sold. If you watch a lot of the old shows and cartoons from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you'll see a lot of moonshiners against the revenuers. You might have seen old-timey jugs marked with the triple X, a symbol famously depicted in popular culture. Historically, these X's indicated the number of times the moonshine had been distilled. Early moonshiners would perform multiple distillation runs, often 3, to achieve a higher alcohol content in a pure spirit, typically exceeding 80% ABV. Despite the clandestine nature of their work, these early distillers took great pride in crafting high-quality product for their local communities, a tradition that endures in modern legal moonshine production. A famous moonshiner was Popcorn Sutton, which I think a lot of people have heard of him. Marvin Popcorn Sutton was an American Appalachian moonshiner and bootlegger. Born in Maggie Valley, North Carolina, he grew up and lived and died in the rural areas around Maggie Valley, nearby Cocke County, Tennessee. He wrote a self-published autobiographical guide to moonshining production, self-produced a home video depicting his moonshining activities, was the subject of several documentaries, including one that received a regional Emmy Award, and is the subject of the award-winning biography and photo book, The Moonshiner Popcorn Sutton. Sutton died by suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning in March 2009, age 62, rather than report to federal prison after being convicted of offenses related to moonshining and illegal firearm possession. Since his death, a new company and associated whiskey brand have been named after him. Moonshine is still made illegally, and also now legally in some states. Currently in the United States, there are 4 states that allow the production of moonshine for personal consumption: Alaska, Arizona, Massachusetts, and Missouri. Additionally, North Dakota law permits the production of moonshine for personal consumption up to the federally legal amount, which is 0 gallons. So I don't know what that means. Entailing the production of any amount is illegal. I'm sure we all know someone, or someone knows someone, who can get us some illegal shine. There's always somebody. There are commercialized distilleries who make legal moonshine now, but is it really moonshine if it's legal? Guess that's for you to decide. So that's the story of the history of moonshine and the Great Moonshine Conspiracy Trial. I think part of what makes Appalachians is the mistrust of government and outside people. So moonshining is at its very heart authentically Appalachian. And of course, it has a dark side. Anything made illegally by the light of the moon isn't exactly wholesome. As I mentioned earlier, I don't drink, but I think most of us have tried some moonshine in our lives. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, thank you for listening. You can follow me on socials under Poison Appalachia. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Lemonade, Threads, Blue Sky, and of course Facebook. I'm the most active on Facebook, as always. And I have a website, which I really need to update. I've been really bad at that. If you're able, please like or rate me and share me on whatever podcast platform you listen to. Talk to y'all next week. Bye.